So the Portland City Council on November 19th passed a new ordinance that's going to affect all housing providers in the city of Portland. And basically what it does is it removes tools that many housing providers have used to set rents. So things where software has provided recommendations or they exchange private information, databases essentially to come up with comparables around rent prices, occupancy rates, etc. That is now a practice that is banned under this new ordinance. And this is Ordinance 030.01.088. If you want to look it up specifically, we'll also have a link in the article and in the videos that you can look that up. But long story short, they've defined what they think price fixing is, and they've defined something called a beneficial owner. So I'm going to read some of this because there's some very specific items you'll want to know. So price fixing here is defined as agreement, verbal, written, or inferred from conduct among two or more persons or entities to set, raise, lower, maintain, or stabilize rent prices, fees, or occupancy levels for dwelling units with different beneficial owners. So that's one part of the definition. Now, they have another definition, which is establishing rental prices, lease terms, or occupancy levels of a dwelling unit using a system, software, process, algorithm, model training, runtime operation, or similar method involving information about historical, current, or anticipated rental prices, price changes, supply, occupancy rates, lease terms, or renewal dates with dwelling units with different beneficial owners. Now, again, very broad in terms of how it's defined. So that's going to be difficult to operate within that scope for a lot of providers. But they do go on to say that a beneficial owner is any individual directly or indirectly exercise substantial control over the ownership interest in a dwelling unit or owns or controls at least 25% of the ownership interest in a dwelling unit. So anyways, this is obviously very complicated. It's not straightforward. What the city of Portland is looking to do is they're trying to copy other cities, notably San Francisco, who rolled out a similar rule last year. And their argument is that, this behavior using private information, they're sharing among landlords who talk directly or indirectly. Maybe they're using the same software program that aggregates data. They're basically saying that that's not allowed. They believe that's price fixing. And part of the argument is that they're drawing from a federal lawsuit against Greystar, which is America's largest landlord, which is a class action essentially saying, they were inflating prices by using these type of algorithms and AI tools. Now, that lawsuit looks like it's going to be settled. So Greystar is obviously not admitting that this is something that they did, and we don't really know. A lot of times when you're in litigation, you're having to make a business decision about, does it make more sense to fight this or to settle this? So obviously we don't know, but this is the argument that the city has, which is, at the end of the day, there's a price fixing, and at the end of the day, it's leading to negative outcomes for renters. Now, there's a lot of flaws with this logic, and I will go in and talk about some of that. But some of the primary things are price discovery is a really important tool when it comes to operating a business, and more information is better, not less information. Now, it assumed that all landlords or housing providers are trying to maximize revenue. That's not necessarily true. And it also means that implies that they're consenting to fix prices within a market or to prevent discounts collectively. So there's a lot of things that don't quite meet what would be considered a traditional definition of price fixing. But one of the things that's actually most alarming is that Zillow has done a study on the effects of this type of ordinance now that this one has been in place for about a year in San Francisco, and has found it's actually having the opposite effect. Instead of rents kind of growing at a reasonable rate according to market supply and demand, you're actually seeing an acceleration of rents growing. And I think a lot of that has to do with because, again, people have less information. They're making imperfect decisions, obviously, and they have to make a lot of assumptions. And they also want to hedge the risk of getting it wrong. So, at the end of the day, was this a bill that was, or an ordinance that was, potentially had good intentions? Sure, yes. But the reality is that it's going to have likely a negative consequence on the Portland market, much like it has in the Bay Area. And so we'll see how this plays out. But what's really, really important to keep in mind is that now housing providers have fewer tools to determine how to set rents. And so it's going to create a little bit more confusion. You're You're going to see larger disparities within rents. And we're going to have other issues at play, which is people potentially leaving the market. And that's because this ordinance didn't simply prohibit the use of these types of tools. It goes on to create penalties, penalties that are substantial per violation. And in this particular case, this ordinance has a 5-year statute of limitations, which is really unusual. Most of the time in Oregon, you have a 1-year statute of limitations on any sort of landlord-tenant dispute. This extends it to 5 years, which is substantially longer than what people typically see. So if you add in the complexity, the increased risk of operating in this market, the potential penalties and legal liability, potentially we're going to see more landlords leave the market. Oregon is already ranked 80th out of 81st when it comes to markets to invest in, according to the Urban Land Institute. So we're not moving in the right direction. We're just creating another environment. And what's most telling, I would say, is that the Oregon legislature looked at this type of policy in the spring of 2025 under Senate Bill 722, and they actually killed that bill and decided not to proceed. And it's because this sort of thing is just a bad idea for all kinds of reasons, but especially given the state of housing in Oregon and in Portland, we have crisis that is not going to lead to more supply. So in any case, it's just important to keep in mind, if you want to stay up on top of landlord best practices, legal changes, then go ahead and hit the subscribe button. We're going to continue to provide content for landlords, whether you're a client of ours or not, so that you know how to operate in the market.